One of the names for the trauma of being human is the death of God. And I'm going to explain what that term means in the next 15 minutes. One thing, by the way, that traditional theists and traditional atheists agree on is that this term is poetic at best. It's not a logical concept. So if you're a traditional theist, God, by definition, if you take Anselm, who gives you the best definition of God traditionally, is God is a necessarily existing being. If God exists, God has to exist. God cannot not exist. God is infinite and eternal. Therefore, God cannot die. And for the traditional atheist, God is an illusion. God is a fiction or a projection. And because God is not living, God cannot die. So what both agree on is that at best, it's poetry. It's a theopoetics to talk about the death of God. But what I want to say is it's a philosophical concept. It's a logical concept. And I'm going to give you the genealogy of it. And it starts, interestingly, in Judaism. And it starts with the Apostle Paul, who is the first person, basically, to talk about the death of God. And not only does he talk about the death of God, he thinks it's central. He says, I preach Christ crucified. Now, that is a crazy, absurd idea. We can't really get our heads around how absurd it is, because God is the name for the absolute, the thing that is eternal, complete, necessary, and essential. And Paul says, this thing dies. So the concept starts in a religious environment. But then nobody does anything with it for a long time. The first 5 or 7 centuries of Christianity, there's virtually no interest in the crucifixion. Early Christian art doesn't have any of it. Christian poetry doesn't have any of it. It's not very significant at all until Luther. And Luther makes it central to his thinking. So before humanism, before Feuerbach, all of that, Luther says that every time we conceptualize God, we make something in our own image. God is always an idol. The God we believe in does not exist. And Luther said the only type of God you can believe in is the God that died. Because he says it's so absurd, nobody would come up with it. The idea that the eternal dies, that the most powerful thing in the world is powerless, that the lightest thing in the world lies in darkness, this is a type of absurdity. And Luther didn't go very far with it. He just says you have to accept the craziness of it, enter into the absurdity of that idea. Right. So then we've got Luther. Now I want to jump to Hegel. Hegel is the one who raises this notion to the level and the dignity of a philosophical concept. So for Hegel, in brief, life is a series of contradictions that we're trying to overcome, right? So we come into being by trying to overcome some sort of problem or contradiction in our lives. And each time we try to overcome it, we end up with a deeper contradiction. We don't end up solving contradictions, but going further and further into them. Just like an analysis, you say, listen, I can't sleep. I'm clenching my jaw at night. And then you see that as a contradiction. You want to shout at your partner, but you also want to keep quiet. And so the contradiction comes out in a sore jaw, right? You're tired all the time, but you're also addicted to work, right? So this contradiction between wanting to work but wanting to protest because your parents wanted you to work, whatever it is, there is a congealment of contradiction, which is what a symptom is. You go to the analyst, you begin to work it out. And you get over the first contradiction about wanting to shout at your partner and not shout at your partner by realizing you wanted to shout at your parents and not shout at your parents. You resolve the first contradiction by going into a deeper contradiction. And the idea is you keep going deeper into contradiction until you realize that contradiction is at the very heart of reality itself, that you are a contradiction between life and death, between love and hate, between light and dark. And that every time you try to avoid the chaos and the cosmos of your life, you try to separate these out, you miss something. And for Hegel, God goes through this. The first concept of God, it comes about as the eternal, the essential, that thing that that does not change. But then Hegel says that concept of God gradually over time goes through these various contradictions until the notion of my God, why have you forsaken me? The moment when you realize that God is self-divided, that God is not at one with God. In philosophical terms, it means that reality is not at one with itself. Reality isn't one and it isn't two. Reality is not one. Now, Hegel calls it absolute knowledge. When you actually not just hear that, me saying it doesn't do it, but when you climb the ladder, when you go through the work of following the contradictions, you eventually hit absolute knowledge, which is the knowledge that reality is woven with chaos. The cosmos has chaos within it. Necessity has contingency within it.